Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's office hours. What is this? Wednesday, July 27th, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Daylight Savings Time? No, I don't know. At any rate, I'd like to welcome anyone who's watching this in real time, which I don't think is anyone yet, or people who are going to watch this in its time-shifted glory. By way of introductions, I am Ben McCorkle. I'm one of the instructors for this MOOC, and I'll turn it over to everyone else to introduce themselves.
Sure. Hi everyone, again, I'm Chad Iwerks. I'm also one of the graduate instructors for this MOOC as well. Happy to be here again this week for office hours. Woo!
Hi, I'm Paula Miller, and I'm also one of the instructors for this MOOC.
Wonderful. So we are going to talk about a number of things today, things that are on your plate as you're working through composing for public audiences, as you're moving from Module 2 into Module 3. We want to highlight some of the activities and assignments. We want to talk about some of the assignments in more detail, kind of game through how you might approach the main assignment, and other odds and ends along the way. I thought we might first start off with a little housekeeping kind of segment of our show. So I think I want to turn it over to Chad to mention some of that.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So one of the things that I was going to mention is this module, it's slightly different from the past two modules that we've had. So for Module 1 and Module 2, each module was 1 week long. So it sort of fit into a perfect package where you would be able to do the reading by Wednesday, contribute to discussion posts throughout that time, and then do your assignment, your module assignment, by the end of the week when it was due. This one's a little bit longer, and so we are aware of the fact that people might be taking some of this time to be able to catch up. This module has quite a bit more video to watch than the past modules, and other readings to contribute to as well. But don't forget that Wednesday is the day of next week, is the day that you'll want to make sure that you are completed with the module assignment. But there are other things to be completing along the way too, so don't forget to be contributing to those discussion boards that are here for Module 3. They're created to really scaffold the assignment that's due next week, so you can get feedback on all of those. But you really can't take advantage of it if you don't do them and allow for time for feedback to be given. So that's my very long-winded way of saying, don't forget to contribute to the discussion boards, everybody. Yeah.
Great. So Module 3 is primarily about multimodal composing, visual rhetoric, basically thinking about how arguments are made using elements that go beyond alphabetic text. So as part of that, we want you to kind of analyze things out in the wild. We want you to think deliberately about recrafting an argument centered around your social cause for the PSA assignment, which is the main component of this module. We want you to, think about certain aspects when you review each other's work, and we want you to engage in, if you're up to the challenge, engaging in a level up activity that's designed to kind of extend, your rhetorical thinking about multimodal composing. So that's kind of a big, hefty grab bag. I wanted to talk, somewhat loosely about some of the things when we've run this MOOC in the past that we've encountered, and that is, the occasional kind of technological kind of trepidation that sometimes students feel when they enter into this. They say to themselves, I'm not a graphic designer, or I don't know Photoshop, or I don't know how to use iMovie. What kind of advice can we give students or participants who are wrestling with that kind of anxiety?
Do you want us to take that question?
Sure.
I mean, the first thing that popped into my head is you can, I guess you need to decide early on if you want to use this opportunity to learn new technologies and just go out there and see what kind of free tools are available to manipulate things like audio or video or pictures. And there are so many different resources that you, Ben, and Susan have given through your videos and instructional material on those free resources. But I think it's also important to say you don't have to use those. There are probably technologies that you are familiar with or have encountered in some sort that can manipulate these things as well. If you have a cell phone, there are apps on there that will do things like basic manipulation of video or audio. You might just want to be playing around with a picture in Microsoft Word or its Open Office version, if that's something that you have available to you and you've done before. I think that you don't have to be using all of these fancy, expensive programs to be making really effective, rhetorical, multimodal compositions. You can use the resources that you are already familiar with as well. So that's the first thing that I thought of.
Great. Paula, anything you'd like to add?
Well, you know, there was this really wonderful study. I wish I could find it right now. I'll see if I can find it. But it was done fairly recently with 2 classes of school children. And stay with me, this connects to multimodality, right? But they were, I think, either elementary or middle school students in a science class. And in one class, they taught students about all of the successes that famous inventors had made, you know. And in the second class, they taught the students about all of the ways that the inventors had failed before they'd succeeded, made their discoveries, created their inventions. And they found that those students who heard about the failures and then later successes were actually more willing to take risks in their own work and to see failure as a starting point. So I think when it comes to multimodal composing and really any sort of task that feels outside your comfort zone, when we think about, well, it might not be great at first, and that's okay. We'll try something else if that's not doing what we want it to do. If a program isn't working for you, like Chad said, you can decide to engage with it and learn. There's so many tutorials on YouTube you can find to help you. But if you decide, you know, that program's not for me, that's okay too. That's a learning moment. That was a useful failure. Try something else. So I encourage you to just like keep trying and don't be afraid of failure, because failure is part of learning and progressing.
Useful failure. That's a great phrase. I'm going to carry with me after this. Yeah, my old standby line is I like to encourage play, whether it be in writing or multimodal composing or any of a number of aspects of teaching in a traditional sense. You're not going to break anything, and so, well, you might occasionally break stuff, but chances are low. So mess around with it. You know, if Command Z is your friend, if you go down a path that you don't intend or you don't like, undo. You know. I think sometimes some cognitive dissonance enters into the process when we engage in multimodal composing that isn't present when we're engaged in traditional writing. And so the idea of like trying out a strategy in writing isn't as daunting sometimes as trying out a design concept. You know, so what I would encourage is maybe rapid prototyping. You know, do different versions of a concept, radically different. Play with scale, play with color, play with the absence of color, play with all type, play with little text, mostly image. Do the inverse of that. That kind of like play can really open up some aesthetic possibilities that ultimately have much more rhetorical impact. So anyway, we've been talking about this concept of multimodal composing. I think maybe we should unpack that definition a little bit. What is it we mean when we say multimodal composing? I have no idea. Do you guys have any idea?
I mean, I think the way I unpack it when I teach these assignments in a face-to-face class is I say, okay, so here's the word on the board. We've got multi and we've got modal. And multi, of course, means, we've got lots of different. And then our mode of composing is sort of the avenue we take to communicate some sort of idea, the tool we use, whether the mode is like an audio mode or video or still images. So when we talk about composing multimodally, it's using more than one mode. Like a text-based essay would be one mode, but if we incorporate images like a newsletter, then it becomes multimodal.
I think adding on a little bit to what you said, Paula, too, I think of the introductory video that you give for this unit, I think, too, Ben, and you talk about how in the history of rhetoric, there's been such an emphasis on speech and writing, and there's not been, until fairly recently, like a real reclaiming of things like images and sound, and all the different sort of like sensory ways that you can compose as also being very rhetorical. And so I think maybe I see, it's going to sound maybe a little academic-y, like not a good sort of like introductory definition, but I also see multimodal as being a very politically charged word, as saying we're also going to be looking at things that have not traditionally been thought of as rhetorical. Because I even think like, I mean, I'm always reminded of what Cynthia Self, who has been an instructor for this MOOC before, and our participants have probably seen in other videos, always reminds me that written text is also multimodal. What you decide to use as like a typeface, or the size of that typeface, the different font you're using, color, I mean the things that you mentioned, Ben, those are all also multiple modes. So even when you're just writing text into the computer, as the participants have been completing their first and second assignments for the first and second modules, those have also been multimodal writings. We just don't think of them as multimodal.
Right. And Chad, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's historically kind of constrained, right? If we think of rhetoric, echoing Aristotle, as the available means of persuasion, for a really large swath of our history, we haven't had some modes easily available to us, right? So in terms of public discourse, speech and the written word kind of were easy to get at. But manipulating things like typeface, well, that was the province of the print shop, right, for the longest time, until the desktop computer made that easier. And you know, along with that, video editing, audio editing, and suddenly these things are available to us, and they are modes that we are able to kind of incorporate into the communicative act, if you will, in such a way that suddenly they're rhetorical. We didn't think about them before, but now we're thinking about them, and we're actually using them, and I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, totally.
Totally.
Totally. Channeling my West Coastness there.
So, where are we going with this? I'm trying to pull up my talking points, which I think I just accidentally closed. Hold on.
The next question, as you're pulling them back up, was it, so what then, if we think of and we know what multimodal composing is, then what's the value of learning about it, specifically as we're thinking about the title of this course, which is Composing for Public Audiences? So what value does learning how to write and understand multimodal composition, what is that value as we think about public audiences specifically?
Right. Paula, you field that.
So we're talking about the PSA assignment?
Well, just before that even, I think, So, like, what value does multimodal composition have when thinking about writing for public audiences?
You know, I think there's a certain power in thinking about embracing multiple modes to communicate your message, because people respond. I mean, individuals respond differently to different means of communication. So if you rely heavily on one mode, and you're trying to be persuasive, then you might be missing out on other people. It is less accessible. So if we think about when we create our PSA using words, maybe print text, on top of like images or on top of video, thinking about how audio might play into it, those are more avenues for, you know, communicating or persuading. So it can be really useful. You know, it's just like supercharging your message.
One of the big concepts that I think about when I teach rhetoric to students is this idea of transferability, right? That if, broadly speaking, your goal in crafting any kind of message is to entertain someone or to teach someone or to persuade them to some sort of action, then this works by very particular ways that we are exploring in this MOOC, right? The classical appeals and so forth. And so what does that look like when it is conveyed in speech? How does that look differently when it is conveyed in text? How does that look differently when it's conveyed graphically? You know, if we talk about a concept, for example, like ethos, you do that differently when you invoke or utilize different modes, but at the end of the day, it's still ethos-based moves that we're making. And so thinking about how the message kind of gets reshaped, you know, that McLuhan, the medium is the message kind of mantra, is worth doing because you encounter, you know, persuasive text of all modes and all stripes and all forms, you know, in most hours of your waking life, and they are trying to persuade you to do or think or feel particular ways. So it behooves you, I think, to think about how it works differently depending on how the message is packaged.
Yeah, one thing that I was thinking about too is a number of people are interested in disability in this iteration of the MOOC, and so I'm thinking about if you are writing or consuming or producing writing for a public audience, you would hope that that would also be accessible to the widest range of people in the public that you're gearing it toward, your audience as well. And it just makes me think of, too, like the different ways that certain media are not accessible. And so being able, as you're talking to Ben about that translation as well, the rhetorical shift that happens, I think, is so important, and so I think too is the sort of like accessible shift that happens too, like who then does not have access to that sound, or who doesn't have access to those words even because of disabilities that affect literacy, or even just like sentence construction. So I think like all of these different ways of thinking about public, like it just makes total sense. Of course multimodal writing is important for a public audience because it consumes it so much and needs it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point because it really kind of grounds the concept of audience in real world kind of considerations. The idea that some people, for example, are visually impaired, or some people are maybe hearing impaired, and so forth. That has an effect on how initially receptive a message can be in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think when we think generically about the, you know, a mass audience, you know, there's historically been this tendency to kind of normalize how we think messages should go out to those people. And so those, you know, things as simple as including transcripts or captions in video can have a huge kind of impact about sending implicit messages about who is entitled to hear these messages, and to what ends. So let's drill down a little into this assignment, the PSA itself. What do we want to say about that?
Well, I think it's important to remind students you have some options on what form you want this PSA to take. Mm-hmm. So if you want to dive into the world of video editing or use some of the great apps that make it really easy for you, you can create a video. You could choose to create a photo story, which is just a series of still images or text. You can include audio or not. Or you could create a poster or a postcard. And you could even do some of your creating non-digitally if you were comfortable, if you were more comfortable with that. So you have a lot of choices here for this PSA, which I think is really exciting. I'm excited to see the range of projects that come rolling in.
Paula, that's something I meant to say earlier. This idea, when you alluded to maybe doing non-technical kind of handcrafting or what have you in conjunction with this. Sometimes I advise my own students in digital composing classes to think about their weaknesses as strengths, right? So, like if for example, they don't have experience with digital animation, and who does really, unless that's your profession or you're really avid hobbyist. Why not think of other means by which you can create animated, text? So, for example, I had a student once who did kind of stop motion technique on a whiteboard. So she drew a picture on a whiteboard, erased the limbs, adjusted the limbs, shot, in sequence, and eventually made a pretty serviceable a short cartoon featuring this character moving around on a whiteboard. The point of that is that it was a handcrafted aesthetic. It wasn't as polished as something Pixar might have come up with, but by the same token, it had its own charm, it had its own ethos, it had its own vibe that it was giving out that I think ultimately served the finished text well. So when students or participants in this MOOC or people in general kind of think to themselves, oh, I can't even begin to create this kind of text because I don't have this technical skill set, that's doing yourself a disservice, because it's likely that you have skills that can translate or transfer in such a way that you can create a really interesting finished product. Let's game this out a little bit. Let's pretend, Chad. Well, we're not pretending. Chad, you're actually technically a student in this MOOC, right?
I both. I have my sneaky student account so that we can experiment with peer review. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I won't be in the mix of peer review for this time. But we were trying to figure it out. So both, yes.
But for the sake of argument,
okay.
You're a participant in this MOOC. You have been presented with this assignment in Module 3. How do you approach it? First of all, what's your topic?
What would my topic be? Well, I think it would be related to disability. Mm-hmm. I guess maybe I can use an example, actually, of something. So I was helping to co-teach an upper sort of undergraduate level course in global human rights and disability studies, and the class kind of decided as one of its potential final projects we were going to create something that was like a PSA to sort of like stage on campus as a way of basically just like raising awareness of disability presence on our campus and having people aware of the fact that there are a couple of things that need to be addressed, particular to this identity. So one of the things that we were thinking about was creating a poster to have on the campus-wide bus system that shuttles students around it. So Ohio State, for those who don't know, is a pretty large campus and would be pretty hard to navigate without the bus system for some students. And the buses that they have on campus, believe it or not, are accessible, but none of the drivers are trained in how to use the accessibility features of the bus. So they're really not accessible. So nobody really knows how to like do, so buses can do like sort of like a kneeling function so that they're lower to the curb. So if somebody has issues stepping up on a step, they can do that. It also will like, I'm going to try to display it and describe what I'm doing, like kind of like fold out like this so that people who are wheelchair users would be able to like wheel up and then be on the bus. So we were thinking of having a poster that would be displayed on these buses, and we didn't actually like fully conceptualize what this poster would end up being, but something about like take a look around and think about who's not on the bus with you, and then just have images of people. Of course, we were like, well, that kind of gets a little bit into like issues of representation of disability. Who are we choosing to like be in this poster? Things like that. So then there was talk of doing something like we were going to stage a protest where we were all going to grab like wheelchairs from like the Wexner Medical Center, and then like have one of the buses come up and just like have 50 people all in wheelchairs just like standing outside the bus and invite like the newspaper to come and stuff like that. So that didn't really happen either. But I mean, these are maybe some ideas that could potentially have been things to work through.
So what's interesting about this topic is that there's real-world exigence. In other words, there's a clear sense of purpose that's driving the conceptualization here. Additionally, there's a clear end game. You know, there's a purpose to what you want to accomplish. You've thought about where this thing might exist in space. These are all fundamental rhetorical concerns. So let's set aside the performance art protest kind of component. And let's talk about the poster itself. So you had an idea for a slogan. You had kind of a general idea for maybe the visuals. Can we drill down into that a little bit? Like, in other words, like let's go from the stage where you're maybe drafting or brainstorming or kind of doing a rough idea of a poster, and how do you go from that to actually kind of giving it greater detail?
Okay, yeah, like in terms of some of the like technological aspects of it too, are you thinking like the production?
Yeah, absolutely, practical. Like, for example, if I were approaching something like this, I might pull out my Moleskine notebook, for instance, and start just sketching stuff out with a pen or a pencil before I even sat down at the computer. How do you work?
Yeah, I think what I would do is I would start with the technology. So the first thing that I would do is probably create something like a mock-up of like a background, and I would probably use something like Photoshop just because I'm familiar with it and I have access to it. But even, I don't know, I don't even know like how this like classifies me as a learner, but I would want to sort of like see the space of like, I'd want to see the diameter or the parameters of what I would be working with, and just sort of like start to create and just play around with that, like with different colors, maybe choose like a font that I liked that kind of like looked aesthetically pleasing with it. I'd probably want to incorporate maybe like some logos that would associate it with like the Ohio State University. And then I would also have to be thinking about, okay, like I'm also going to have a camera, and I'm going to have to schedule a time then to like incorporate the images that we want to do, or find something that would be like in the Creative Commons that I could work with. But I think, yeah, I would kind of start like in that technology kind of playing around, because it would also, I think, help me determine what I could do. bringing different things in and whatnot.
Okay. So you had an idea for a slogan. What was the slogan again?
I think it was something along the lines of like, take a look around and see who's not on the bus with you.
Paula, weigh in here. What do you think about this? Does this slogan work for you?
I love the kernel of it. I wonder if we can play with the language, or it feels long, but I wonder if with our multimodal composition, we could maybe think about how to break it up, like how we might lay it out on the page to emphasize the two parts, because what I'm hearing is there are two parts. Take a look around, and then who's not on the bus with you, right? So doing something like at the top or the bottom, larger text, smaller text. I mean, what do y'all think? I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah.
All right, Chad.
Well,
Is this good?
I love it, and I think the one thing that now as I'm going through the revision in my head of this, thinking like the whole take a look around thing is also kind of ableist in a way too, because some people can't look around. So yeah, I wonder if just the like who's not on this bus with us, or yeah, kind of. I think getting rid of that beginning part sounds like something that I would do were I doing this.
Is there a way to convey that the sense? Sorry, I'm getting an echo. The sense of that first phrase, take a look around, admitting it's problematic, admitting that potentially it's too much text. One thing that's nice about it is that it actually directly addresses the viewer on the person riding the bus, and so maybe there's a way to convey that sense of direct address without actually using that text. For example, simply having an image of the interior of the bus incorporated into the design of the thing kind of suggests where you are, what you should be doing, that sort of thing. I don't know. Maybe that's too simple.
I mean, another thing that kind of like popped into my head, just like spitting it out and putting it out there and brainstorming, is you could also like stage people on the bus, like a scene of people on the bus with like a shadow of like wheelchair user, or yeah, I'm not sure, or like outlines to sort of like convey this sense of like there's potential, like this person should be here, this person should be included, but currently is like missing. There's a hole right now, right? Yeah.
Like a white silhouette with a dotted border or something like that.
Yeah. Now that's going to take some more like technological kind of skill, but I mean, it could also just be like as simple as putting that shape in there and then cutting it out or something, Yeah.
Right.
Well,
I don't know. What do you think, Paula?
So I was thinking, and this might be beyond the bounds of the assignment, but it will be interesting to think about a PSA campaign. Am I echoing?
I don't hear an echo, no.
Okay. Thinking about a PSA campaign, thinking about like who's not here, and then release that PSA, because you can anticipate the bus riders who are on the bus are probably frequent bus riders, right? And when you're sitting on the bus, I know like I read the advertisements over and over. So having a who's not on the bus, and then sort of like gradually releasing like the dotted line ones or the shadow ones on different buses at different times. So like having a series of almost duplicate ads, but having them communicate something new each time would be really kind of neat and effective, I think.
That's a great idea. And one thing it does is it acknowledges that the format it isn't simply static. It exists in time and space. These advertisements, they get cycled in and out, and different people step on and off the bus, and they see them at different times. And acknowledging not just the medium, but the greater context within which that medium exists is that's the heart of rhetorical savvy. You're thinking about circulation theory, in a sense. How does this text work its way through an audience through time? The idea of like a message that builds and changes and reinforces itself, and then maybe eventually has a strong invocation to action, is something that could be ultimately more powerful than a single isolated poster itself. Yeah, how many designs do you have in you, Chad?
I'm sorry, I think that was broken up a little bit, but I heard my name. Did you ask a question?
I asked how many different design concepts do you have in you?
Oh, geez, infinite. All the time for it, yeah.
And it occurs to me, if you land on some sort of visual kind of motif, like the idea of the missing body with the dotted outline, that's an idea that could carry over across a series, right? So it could be a figure in a wheelchair, or it could be a figure, a different series of figures over time, and suddenly they create a narrative and raise awareness that way. But yes.
Yeah. I'll need to teach another class so that they can do that.
Well, it sounds like a worthwhile cause, and definitely, like, the idea, if implemented, I think could have a real-world impact. So that's kind of cool. The trick is actually pulling it off. Yeah. And this is something that our participants might ultimately think about doing, because definitely they have latched onto causes that they feel strongly about, and they're interested in making changes in the real world. And so beyond just the exercise of doing this assignment in a MOOC, one of the things we're thinking about in the future is encouraging you to push these messages out into the real world and seeing what kind of impact they can have out there. So this might be an opportunity. I mean, just talking through this hypothetical example with Chad, hopefully it demonstrates to you, if you're watching, that you can act similarly. The message might be different, the medium might be different, but the impulse, I think, to kind of actually move the world is pretty noble. All right, what else do we want to talk about?
I was just thinking too about sharing. So I think the like bus and transit idea might be one of a more time-consuming, technologically savvy, primarily image-based kind of project. But I had also thought of one that was actually very, by comparison, low-tech that someone did on campus. And I'm not sure if you guys saw it, but Melanie Yergo, when she's now in Michigan, but when she was a graduate student here in Ohio, did a campaign on her own about stereotypes and perceptions about autism, and they were very minimalist, and I've seen some pictures of them, and they come out like they just beautiful how they are. It's very simple, just like white background with black text on them, and they'll just say things like, larger text will say the stereotype like all people with autism are male, and then below that in smaller text, same font, same typeface, but just smaller, it will say something like, except the person who wrote this, who's a woman. And then but there were tons of them, like, autistic people don't date, and then underneath it, it's smaller, and it says and I definitely would never date you, or something like that. Just little kind of snarky kind of things like that, that I think the sort of rhetorical work that's being done through it is that humor that she's creating in it. But the sort of like mode that she selected to create that announcement, or I mean, I guess we could call it a PSA, was actually very low, like very low tech. It was just she was creatively using the size of different typeface to be able to convey sort of like a conversation and a persona through that PSA. But yeah, no images or anything, and that's almost, I think, what made it really persuasive, because as you were walking by, like, it's like, oh, this text kind of by itself, I think it really worked how it was presented. Yeah.
Signal versus noise. I think when you consider where these things might exist in the real world, in real space and real time, it invites an opportunity to rethink what the rules of the game are. As soon as you, Chad, were describing that, one thing that struck me is that if there's a flyer or a poster campaign going up on campus, those individual posters have to compete with all the other posters and flyers on the campus. And if you take a look at them as a whole, they can tend to be over-designed, saturated with color, very busy. And so what do you do to kind of break through the noise and get your signal through? Well, you might play against all of that cacophony, right? You might go super minimalist. You might just manipulate text. And then correspondingly, when I'm walking across the oval and I happen to see that thing, it jumps out at me. You know, it doesn't make sense. It's low tech. It's ratcheted back. But because of the context, because of all the other noise, the design noise that's out there, it really kind of resonates in a way that you know is kind of surprising. All right. So where do we go from here? What else? I'm looking at the time. We're about 2:45, or a little more. What do we want to say to the participants before we run out of time?
I think we've covered our questions that have kind of come in for the week. Did we want to preview anything about next week too?
You know what I think is exciting about next week is that the course librarian is going to be part of the office hours. So you'll get to meet Melissa Cherry, who's our librarian, and there's going to be some conversation about research strategies, because the next project in the course after the PSA is going to be the research-based argument assignment.
Wonderful. Yeah, and hopefully by now the logic of how we've structured this course is becoming apparent to you. You know, starting from the personal. You know, where is your voice? Where is your authority? Where is your ethos? How do you build upon that in a way to kind of marshal the power of other voices? You know, other experts in the field that might say or otherwise communicate something about your topic. How do you reach a public audience? How do you reach a more specialized audience? So as you move through, you're kind of exercising different rhetorical muscles, as it were, on your way to global world domination. That's the grand plan, at least. We'll see if it happens.
Yeah, that's great. One thing that I'll just mention briefly too, because it came to mind, was one thing I really love about both this Module 3 unit assignment and then Module 4 is not only are they real-world documents that do circulate, and so can very well be things that you as participants decide to put out in the world and affect change. But what's really cool too about them is we also have peer review set up for these two assignments as well, so that you will have time to not just respond through something like the the discussion boards, but also be able to do that through sort of like a more intense one-to-one connection through peer review. And I bring that up too because there's mentioning of a couple of different peer review materials on this module that are kind of like tacked on, but definitely like check those out too to kind of learn a little bit more about the peer review process and what's happening too. I think we lost Paula and she just called me.
Paula, no.
Yeah. Let's see. Because I think she has to end our session even, huh?
Yeah,
We're stuck live forever.
Until then, we just talk about the PSA. Or, you know, while we're waiting for Paula to come back and eventually pull the plug on us, maybe we should talk a little bit about the Level Up assignment.
She's back.
There she is.
My computer actually just restarted it to install, but I'm here on my phone.
Nice.
Technology. So one thing briefly I wanted to mention is that there's the Level Up assignment associated with this module is really worth checking out. It's a lot of fun. Basically, it asks you to create a spoof of an example of quote-unquote high art. You know, so famously, you know, you may have seen, you know, if you've gone to Myrtle Beach and seen T-shirts where the Edvard Munch's The Scream has been turned into like, you know, like Homer Simpson, or it has a smiley face on it, or something like that, or the Mona Lisa with a mustache, or you know, any of these kinds of permutations. The idea of deflating or bringing down to earth the highfalutin world of fine art, you know, is a time-honored tradition. And here's an opportunity for you to participate in that activity. All right. So where do we go from here? Any parting words? Any other bits of advice? Any other tidbits?
I mean, I think the only thing I could add is I encourage you not to be afraid to experiment and try new things, and also not to be afraid to stick with what's comfortable. But, you know, be strategic about your choices. Don't let yourself be limited by fear.
Very encouraging words.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, I think that's a really positive note to end on, guys. So maybe we should just call it.
That sounds great. We'll see you next week, everybody. Bye, all.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.